That's good. That's good to tell you.
Yeah. I speak from experience.
Oh, hi. Nice to finally meet you.
Yeah. It took so many times I've seen your name and read your stuff.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember whether we met or not.
I don't think we actually ever did, although we almost did a few times, I think. But
you were going to come to a program you had in Chiang Mai or something, and you didn't make it for some reason.
yeah, it was the timing. Yeah, I wasn't in Thailand at that moment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I should have asked this question earlier, but
Should be about 45 minutes. Yeah. I mean, is that about right, or is it a little bit longer or shorter? Yeah, because I could talk it out a little bit more or less. I'm not going to read it, right?
we've got it right. We've got it to 1:30.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
And we'll just
I mean,
try
I want to give a good time for presentation. Yeah, so it might be a bit more than that, maybe 15 minutes.
Right. We'll try to wrap that up by 1, so we don't have to have a discussion. People will want to talk.
That's fine. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. I'll let you know if we're getting close
Okay.
to time. Welcome, everybody, to the Stimson Center. We're going to get started so that our attendees watching on the live stream aren't sitting there watching a blank screen or listening to me and Ian chat in the background. My name is Brian Eiler. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program, also the director of our Energy, Water, and Sustainability program, which for a long time, more than a decade now, has been engaged at promoting smarter and alternative solutions to water and energy development in the Mekong Basin. We're the only think tank in town that looks at alternatives and sustainable development in the Mekong Basin exclusively. We are now promoting a theory of change that the time is right, the market conditions are right, that within the context of plans for over 180 large dams in the Mekong Basin, some already built, some under construction, and some in the pipeline, that some of those worst performing dams and most impactful in the variety of ways that dams impact livelihoods and environmental flows and downstream communities can be substituted off the map, off the future map, with other forms of energy generation, as well as increased efficiency measures for reducing energy consumption into the future in the Mekong. The market is right for this. Market conditions are developing, as well as the planning conditions, the technical planning conditions globally. If not ready in the Mekong, they're globally ready for this type of smart move for the Mekong region. But another issue that we look at very squarely are the various risks related to hydropower projects in the Mekong Basin, whether it's from the overall pathway of development, which I said has hundreds of dams in the pipeline, or for particular dams in the Mekong. And last summer, at the end of July, there was a dam burst upstream of the Xe Pian Basin. The Xe Pian Namnoy dam burst on July 23rd in southern Laos, and it caused a major disaster, which we're going to learn a lot about today, which displaced thousands of people and unfortunately killed somewhere under 70 or so. And Ian's going to straighten out the data on this for us. And to take a deeper dive into the discussion of dam risks, disaster preparedness, but most importantly, how livelihoods are being affected in southern Laos and throughout the Mekong Basin by hydropower projects broadly. We've invited Dr. Ian Baird to share his thoughts and his analysis on this very unfortunate situation in southern Laos that happened last year. Dr. Ian Baird, I often describe him as the universe's ultimate Mekong expert, and that I really think that no one knows more about the Mekong Basin, livelihoods there, about the peoples of the basin, and particularly of the fisheries ecology than Ian. So we're really honored to have him with us here today. Ian is our go-to resource when we run into roadblocks and areas of the Mekong that we don't understand. And I've recently published a book the last days of the mighty Mekong, which Ian has cited throughout, and his research, if you look at the bibliography, has the most attribution throughout this book. Ian has long been working in the Mekong Basin. He started working there in the early 1990s, working with communities in southern Laos on the Cambodian border. And he started an NGO there called GAPE, and maybe we can get into some of the history of GAPE either during his presentation or during our discussion session. And then went to graduate school, from my understanding, and is now the associate professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has been training a well-informed cohort of undergraduates and, most importantly, graduate students so that they can further deploy research as well as smart development options for the Mekong Basin. So again, it's a real honor and a pleasure to have Ian here with us today. We are live streaming, and this gives us an opportunity for those who are tuning in on the live stream to ask questions to Ian for the Q&A portion. So if you do have questions, please tweet to us your question using the hashtag #StimsonToday. Hashtag #StimsonToday. And my colleague Courtney Weatherby is monitoring the Twitter, and she'll be asking questions to Ian. So we're going to start out with a 45-minute introduction to the Xe Pian Namnoy Dam disaster, and then have a robust conversation afterwards. Please welcome Dr. Ian Baird.
Thank you. I've actually been looking at the Xe Pian Namnoy Dam for quite a long time. The dam was actually first studied back in 1995. So the project's been going much longer, but during the financial crisis of 1997-98, it was canceled. And then for many years it sort of was dormant, and then it was revived again. So what we're talking about now is the more recent situation, but this information is relevant for the present situation, which I'll explain as we move along. So, thinking about the dam breaking itself, there was a saddle dam that broke on July 23rd, 2018, and it released less than, a lot of people have said 5 million cubic meters, but it's actually less than that because there were 5 million cubic meters of water in the reservoir. Not all of it went out, but let's say up to 5 million cubic meters was released at that time. It swept away 6 villages, really heavily impacted, and then another 7 villages were also heavily impacted, but to a lesser extent than the first 6. Up to about 7,000 people were displaced as a result of this. Probably the number is more like 6 or even maybe 5,000, because a lot of the people that were actually listed as living in those villages were not there at the time that it happened. They were away working elsewhere, or they were going to school in another place or something like that. But in any case, some thousands of people were displaced, and the present count now is 49 people having been definitely killed, and they've found the bodies, and another 22 which they've confirmed from relatives that they were indeed in the village at the time, and they were washed away, and their bodies have not been found. So they're assumed to be dead. The Lao government assumes them to be dead. So we're looking at 71 people in total. There was also heavy flooding downstream as a result of this in Cambodia, in northeastern Cambodia, in Stung Treng province, that caused a huge amount of damage to agriculture. There were no deaths, but there was a large amount of damage done due to the water release, because actually the Xe Pian River runs into the Saigon River just above the border with Cambodia. So really this happened not far from the border with Cambodia. So it's not surprising that it had that kind of an impact. So you can see on the map there, approximately where it's located. And in the southernmost part of Laos. And that's a picture of the dam. It's not the picture of the saddle dam that was broken. That's another dam. The dam that broke wasn't one that was designed to release any water or produce any energy. It was just designed to hold water in the reservoir. And this would be the dam that would actually be producing the energy. So the project itself has a capacity of 410 megawatts, or will when it's completed, and the cost is estimated to be about $1.02 billion. And as many other dams in Laos, it's built as a build, operate, and transfer project, which means that there's a concession agreement in which the consortium of investors agree to build the project, and then they fund the project, and then they set up a power purchase agreement to sell the energy, and then afterwards they get the money from that, and then after a certain period of time they transfer the dam over to the Lao government. So in this case, I think it's 27 years that they have. And the consortium includes 2 Korean companies, so XK Engineering and Construction has the largest share, which is 26%. Western Power, another Korean company, has 25%. Ratchaburi Power, which is a Thai company, has 25%. And Ratchaburi Power, the majority shareholder, is actually the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand. So essentially that's a Thai government company, more or less. And then the Lao government has about 24% share in the project. And the Lao government did not have a lot of capital to put into this project, and their capital was largely funded through South Korean overseas development aid. So they received, I think it's about $78 million that was used to fund their portion, along with consideration of land and other in-kind contributions that were used to make up their share of the project. The Laos produces more energy now than they need for their own domestic consumption. So almost all this energy is scheduled to be exported to Thailand, which is the case for most of the large dams that are being built now in Laos. And there is a power purchase agreement in place that will allow that to happen. The Thai government has already agreed to purchase that energy. So we can see here, this is what the reservoir looked like before it was it broke, and then the water came down the Xe Pian River, and then the flooding that occurred downstream, just north of the border with Cambodia. And so that's the way it kind of went. You can see that not all the water in the reservoir went out, but the vast majority of it did. So only a small amount was left after that. And this really shows clearly, what the reservoir looked like. On July 13th, the reservoir looked like that, according to satellite photos. And then on 25th, 2 days after the dam broke, that's what it looked like. So you can see the amount of water that came down at that time. The downstream, once the water was released, it was such a huge amount of water that you had water levels, 10, 12 meters high, covering houses. I mean, this is the roof of a house, right? And this is sometime after, this was a few days after the water was released. So already the water had been going down at that point. So, the amount of water and the amount of flooding that occurred was tremendous, right? And unprecedented for the Mekong River Basin. As one woman described it, when the water came down, it wasn't just like, coming down gradually. It was like a cliff, as they put it. Just like you just see a wall of water coming down on you. So, very, kind of violent, kind of huge amount of water coming down. Obviously, as you go farther down, it was less like that. But at the first village, Ban Hin Lat, where it came down, that was what it looked like to people. That was the way it was described by people who were affected by this. So it was just, a very dramatic kind of situation, and it happened just when just after it had gotten dark, and the vast majority of people had no warning that it was happening. Some people did get a little bit of information, but mostly people didn't know it was coming. And we can get into that later. I won't go into details, but actually the company knew that there were problems with this saddle dam 5 days before it broke. And there was a real problem with getting information out to the villagers. There wasn't a system in place to provide that kind of information. And as a result, and the local government only received information on the day that the dam broke. So it wasn't that the Lao government, but they saw that the dam had sunk by 11 centimeters. They knew that, the company knew that, the Koreans knew it 5 days before it actually broke. So,
can I pop in with a quick two-finger?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the geology of this area and where the reservoir sits in relation to the village down below?
So the reservoir itself is up on the Bulavan Plateau, which is a high plateau of a kind of a relatively flat plateau in the southern part of Laos. It's over at about 1,000 meters above sea level. And when the water was released, it went down to a lower area, which is only about 150 or 200 meters above sea level. So there's a huge difference. The water and that's why a lot of companies have wanted to build dams on the Bulavan Plateau, is because they have this huge differential in altitude, which means that from the potential for electricity generation is very high, because you can create head by releasing water from the higher elevation to the lower elevation. But when the reservoir broke, obviously the water came down very quickly, because it's much lower elevation down below. Basically, the villages that were flooded were below in a floodplain, in the lower, below the Bulavan Plateau, in a relatively lowland area. Okay. So yeah, people were, surprised by this. They jumped. Fortunately, a lot of the people down there are quite good swimmers. They live in a floodplain. They're used to water. They're used to fishing. They can all, mostly they can swim. If they hadn't been able to swim, most of them, it could have been much worse than it was. Many of them had boats that they were able to get into very quickly. And so it could have been much worse than it was, actually. But you can sort of see, the tremendous impact that occurred over a very short period of time. And it's true that this happened during the monsoon season, so it'd been raining quite heavily slightly before this happened. But this was not a natural disaster, right? This was due to the dam breaking, right? And this was something that could have been prevented, right? And I think it's important to understand that the fault on this, the rains that occurred are expected for this time of the year. They happen every year. There's heavy rains, in the end of July or in August. So it could have been anticipated, but it wasn't, right? And this was really because of the saddle dam breaking. And I'll come back to that a little bit later, based on some research that's been done more recently by experts that have been hired by the Lao government, have determined, the impact. I'll come back to that near the end of the presentation. So, this is a little bit later, as after the water had receded to some extent, and rescue people were getting in there and moving people out. Now, one of the things that happened is that not only did a lot of water come down, but a lot of mud, a lot of rocks, and so not only, so people's houses were washed away, but also their rice fields, their lowland paddy fields, were covered with deep mud and rocks. Meaning that even now, it's mostly not possible for them to farm in these areas, because they were just covered with all these debris that was washed down with the water, right? So this was more than simply a short-term kind of an impact where you have a big flood, the water goes down and people go back. Right now, people have not gone back. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but essentially the government has advised them not to go back. They have, partially because they can't do farming there, partially because their houses, a lot of them have been literally wiped out, and also partially because there is concern that the dam could break again in the future. And there was a lot of uncertainty about that, and the government didn't want people to go back for fear that it might happen again. And as I will explain a little bit later, it's also true that many of the villagers are quite scared to go back because they've been affected emotionally by this event. And I'll come back to that also. So initially they were moved into temporary shelters in 5 or 6 locations where they were living in tents for many, many months. Now the government has built some long kind of houses where where they're living now, for the most part. Some of them may also have gone to live with relatives in other villages, if they had relatives in other villages that were able to take them in. But the data on that is a bit unclear, and I think initially the government didn't really want them to do that because they also wanted to provide, aid, and they didn't really want the people scattered all over the place because then they couldn't really distribute that very easily. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is this idea of slow violence, right? Slow violence, according to Rob Dixon, who wrote a book called Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor, is violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Violence is customarily conceived as an event of action or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space, and as erupting into instant sensational visibility. Now, when the dam broke, we didn't have slow violence. We had catastrophic violence, right? But slow violence is actually what's occurring in relation to most of the other dam impacts that are occurring in the country. But because this was a catastrophic event, it's received a lot of attention. But I want to draw some attention to the fact that this dam was causing lots of impacts to people long before it broke. People seem to have the impression that, oh, the dam broke and it caused all these impacts. But even before it broke, it had been causing all kinds of problems. And I'm going to explain those a little bit. And the lack of attention that those impacts have received is, I think, something worthy of considering. So when you have catastrophic events, right, you sort of have risks are viewed as, when you have a catastrophic situation, you have a high level of fatality, big amount of a high impact kind of situation, and this draws a lot of attention to the types of impacts that occur from catastrophic events. The catastrophic events are newsworthy, right? There are things that go on to the news. There are things that the public takes a lot of interest in, right? It's different than slow violence, which tends to not attract the same amount of public attention. It also attracts humanitarian aid. It attracts, government concern in a way that other types of impacts don't result in. So one of the things that has been a kind of product of the way that hydropower development has been occurring in Laos is one could call it it's been called by some researchers hydraulic authoritarianism, which essentially it is extreme. So David Blake and Keith Barney, who are colleagues of mine, they wrote an article about slow violence, and they made the point in 2018 that it is extremely rare for any government of Laos spokesperson to make a public admission of negative social impacts arising from hydro development. This is something that rarely happens. And it is therefore very politically difficult and risky for people in Laos to criticize hydropower dam development in the country. The political situation makes it difficult, and the government is very attached to this idea that their development is linked to hydropower development. So that's kind of the political atmosphere that exists within Laos, and it's made it very difficult for people who've been affected by dams to really make their concerns known. They often self-censor themselves. Even when they've been impacted, they don't necessarily want to say anything. So what was one of the amazing things that occurred when this dam broke was a lot of rumors started to spread in Laos. One of the rumors that I heard, I was in Thailand at the time. I just left Laos about a week earlier. I was in northeastern Thailand when the dam broke. And immediately there was all kinds of information coming out from Lao people that I knew that the minister of energy and mines was rumored to have resigned to take responsibility for the impacts of the dam. I was immediately skeptical that that had happened because there was no precedent for this ever happening. And I was telephoning friends of mine in Laos and Vientiane, both Lao people and foreigners, to say, long-time expatriates who've been living there a long time, to say, hey, is this true? Is this really happened? And initially they were all telling me, oh yes, it's occurred. The minister has resigned. I heard this from at least a half a dozen people. It turned out it was totally untrue. He had not resigned. It was a rumor that had spread widely, but it was not true. And this, one might say, is kind of a product of hydraulic authoritarianism. When you're not able to openly voice your concerns, or you're scared to do that, and you don't really trust the media to report on things accurately, rumors spread quickly. And this seems to be what happened. There was a lot of concern by Lao people, and maybe this was kind of wishful thinking in some people's minds, and this rumor just spread throughout the country. Within a few days, people realized it wasn't true, that he had not resigned. But I think it's notable that that happened, right? Because it does reflect the kind of environment or the situation or the atmosphere that existed at Laos. This is very unprecedented, right? The catastrophic nature of the event really caught the attention of Lao people in a way that has not, people living in urban areas, people living in all parts of the country, in a way that other types of impacts from dams has not in the past. The second thing that happened is there were other rumors that started to spread. Rumors that there was an AP reporter that contacted me and had a stringer working in Laos, and they said that the Xe Pian Dam is threatened to break, and all villagers have been warned downstream to move out. And then in the north of Laos, the Namnoy Hydropower Dam was also rumored to be about to break. In the end, none of these dams broke. But the point again is there seemed to be a lot of public concern in Laos, and these rumors were spreading, and people were believing them. And they were spreading them further, and this became widely known that this was happening. It does suggest the level of attention that this got from, this is a letter that came from a Lao government official, claiming that there was indeed some of these dams did have to release some water because there had been heavy rain, there had been a tropical storm. They were releasing water downstream. So it was a kind of a moment where everybody was very concerned about what was going on. This situation didn't just attract attention in the local area. It attracted attention throughout the country, right? The north, south, all kinds of areas. And it really made people a lot more worried about the safety of dams, which previously had not been much of an issue. The people hadn't been that interested. In fact, another dam had broken about a year earlier. The Namnoy Dam had broken in northern Laos, and there's some amazing video clips that you can find online showing the water coming down in huge amounts. But it was a smaller dam, and the amount of impact was less. But within about a year, you had two dams that broke in Laos, right? So clearly this was adding to the anxiety that existed, right? The other thing that happened that was unprecedented in Laos was the humanitarian aid that was sent to the impacted people in the Xe Pian River Dam. There's never been humanitarian aid given for people impacted by dams in Laos before. This is the very first time because it was conceived as being, a kind of disaster that required, humanitarian aid. So you had also a lot of people in Thailand were donating money. You had, individuals that were coming with trucks full of all kinds of things. There was initially a lot of attention by the public in Thailand as well, and, humanitarian aid agencies. This was happening sort of in the sleepy province of Hydropower, which there's not used to this kind of thing at all. And they were, they didn't really know how to respond to this initially. There was a lot of confusion because this is something that they've never experienced before there. Hydropower has never had this kind of
public scrutiny or this type of disaster before. And so it was a pretty amazing moment. Media attention was also incredible. The number of journalists that wanted to go in. And the Lao government wasn't used to dealing with this either. Typically, you know, if a journalist applies to go to Laos to do stories, it may take a few weeks before they get their accreditation to be able to do this. Now, obviously, this was a disaster. Journalists wanted to get in there within the next day or two. The Lao government was sort of operating in their normal way. And a lot of the journalists that I spoke to were, you know, thought that the Lao government was trying to kind of deceive them, or they were trying to keep things secret. I don't actually believe that was the case. I don't think that the Lao government was doing anything intentional to try to, you know, keep people, deceiving people. But they just weren't used to this kind of fast movement, right? You know, the media itself, you know, like sometimes if they get a story in Laos on a Friday, well, then they take the weekend off, and then they get back and they write it up on Monday, and maybe it'll come out on Wednesday or something like that. You know, that's just normal practice, you know. So people thought that they were trying to keep this from the public, but I don't think that actually was the case. I think it was more of an unintentional situation. But the Thai media was trying to go in there. There was the New York Times. I mean, all the big news agencies were taking this issue very seriously. I myself got over 30 media inquiries within a week, which is really unprecedented, you know, by CNN and BBC and, you know, Reuters and AP, and, you know, all the big agencies were in touch with me at that time. Finally, they did start to get things organized, and then they were, you know, once things were organized and the Lao government had people down there, then a lot of the media did get better access. And so I don't think, but in the meantime, there were all these rumors floating around amongst the media and about other watchers thinking that the Lao government was trying to cover up the number of people killed. And there were some numbers floating around, you know, 800 people killed, you know, 1,000 people killed, because they said, well, there's 7,000 people apparently in these villages, and there were only like 5,000 people in the resettlement areas. So that must mean there's 2,000 people dead. What they didn't realize is a lot of these people had left beforehand. They were away studying at school. They were working in Vientiane or Paksay. They were not in the area at the time. So there was a lot of, you know, I think that, and there was not very good control of the release of information. So there were also people that were like releasing information saying, we think there's 40 people dead, and then they would revert to saying, well, actually, we only think there's 5 people dead, because we haven't found the bodies. In fact, they probably heard oil reports saying there'd been 40 people dead, but then they decided to change their protocol, and they didn't really communicate that well, so people thought they were trying to cover up the number of people dead. I don't think they were trying to cover it up. I think they were actually being quite honest about it. They just weren't prepared for this. It was something unprecedented for them, and that's what was happening. The media attention. And the other thing was, even in places like Thailand, they couldn't find, I talked to media in Thailand, they had nobody who had any expertise about Adipur. Adipur is a part of Laos that nobody in Thailand knew about. They didn't have anybody who could, so they were asking me very basic things, you know, like, you know, what kind of people live there, you know, like just very basic stuff. Nobody knew what was going on, which I think also led to this kind of suspicion that, you know, this is all a kind of a cover-up, which I don't actually think it was. The other level of, but just to give you a sense of how concerned Lao people were, apart from all the people in Laos that were, you know, I mean, there was a lot of video clips coming out on social media with Lao people, you know, making statements like maybe we should reconsider our dam building policy, you know, what about all those people that have been killed? I mean, a lot of very emotional younger people, you know, were coming out and saying things that, you know, you just never see in Laos, and very risky for them to do that. And they were just, and even Lao migrant workers living in Thailand, this is, came out and openly protested in front of the Lao embassy to ask for the Lao government to take this more seriously. Like, this really attracted the attention and imagination of Lao people, not only in Laos, but even those that were working in Thailand, you know. So they were writing letters and submitting them. It was quite an amazing moment. Now, slow infrastructural violence of the Xe Pian River Dam. I want to talk about that now. So what about all these impacts that I mentioned at the beginning that have been occurring but have not really been, that have not attracted the influence? Now the first is that there is a large number of people that live up on top of the plateau. So they were not impacted by the dam breaking. They lived in the reservoir area previously, or near the reservoir area. And they were moved out of that area beginning in about 1997, 98. I visited some of those villages in 1995 when the original study was going on, because I was actually part of the original environmental impact assessment for the Xe Pian Namnoy Dam that was done in 1995. And they were moved out for the Hui Ha Dam, a couple of villages, but mainly for the Xe Pian Namnoy. They were moved in 1996, 97. Then the financial crisis happened, the dam stopped. But those people had already been moved. 40% of the ethnic group, the Yahurn ethnic group, had been moved. 40% of the whole population, all indigenous peoples, right? 11 villages were moved into another area well outside of their traditional territory, into the territory of another indigenous group. And they were given 3 hectares of land each for farming. And they were put there. And as soon as the government kind of moved away, the other indigenous group came back and said, well, this is actually our fallow land, and they took it back. So all of a sudden, these people had no farmland. They've been suffering with no farmland for over 20 years now. It got so bad for them that when the dam was originally canceled, they moved back to their own villages, 80% of them, despite the fact that the Lao government did not give them approval to do that. But they were so desperate that they moved anyway. And when the new dam, was reinvigorated in 2013 to start doing studies for starting up the project again, then they started to negotiate with them to resettle a second time. And then they were finally resettled in 2017, back to the old resettlement area, but still without agricultural land. So they're sitting there now, having suffered for over a generation with no land for farming. When they moved back to their old villages, their schools had already been removed. They had schools before 1995. But the government wouldn't allow them to establish a school later because they weren't officially supposed to be living there. So all those kids that went with their parents had no education. Before the dam plan, they were going to school. Later, they were not going to school. That's impacted a whole generation of children. Now they're back in that resettlement area without land. They have been desperately impacted. They're experiencing extreme poverty. And when all these news agencies contacted me and they were all interested in the breaking of the dam, I wanted to tell them, well, have you looked at what's been going on with the other people that have been impacted by this project? And there was almost no interest. Almost no interest at all. It wasn't newsworthy. But it's a serious issue that needs to be considered. And it's still not resolved up to now. The second thing that was happening was, as part of the Xe Pian Namnoy Dam, is that you block the Xe Pian River and you divert the water from the Xe Pian River into the reservoir area, and then the water is released through the Xe Namnoy River to produce energy. And you also block the Hui Makjan as well. So there's a couple of rivers that are blocked, and then the water is diverted through the Xe Namnoy. So what that means is people living downstream on the Xe Pian, the people that were impacted by the water coming down on them, were already being negatively impacted before the dam broke. But they were being impacted in a very different way. The river, these are people who live a relatively semi-subsistence lifestyle. They're doing small-scale farming, they're fishing, they're foraging for food. Some of them are indigenous peoples. These are people that live very close to nature in very rural areas, people that have hardly spent any time out of their villages, that have very low levels of education, but rely a lot on nature. Their river had been dried up by this dam. And yet, it received no attention at all. So ironically, the same people that got all that water coming down on them actually had the opposite problem prior to the dam breaking, that they had no water in their river, their fisheries had been destroyed. Their animal protein in these villages is probably about 80 or 90% is fish. So the impact, and this is a place of very poor people with very little money, very low levels of income. They're mainly subsistence oriented. Okay? So these are the type of, this is the slow violence. And this is why I'm comparing the level of interest of the catastrophic event to the level of interest of the slow violence this dam has already been causing for many, many years. And I've written about this, since the 1990s, and but without getting much attention. So ironically, it was when the dam broke, all of a sudden, everybody cares about this project. But prior to that, nobody cared. So I think it's important to understand the types of slow violence that's occurring all over Laos from different types of dams, and the lack of attention that that's received, or recognition that it's even occurring. People that have been resettled, inappropriately compensated, given inappropriate amounts of land for farming. These people just want a basic land for subsistence farming, and 20 years they haven't been able to resolve it. Over 20 years now. So I think that these are important to realize. These are the people up on this is what it looks like up on the top of the Bolivian Plateau. And this is a woman, you heard woman who has been living in the resettlement area now, where they've been living over 20 years without appropriate compensation or being given adequate amounts of land. Many of these Yahurn people were also formerly allied with the United States during the Vietnam War, which may also have affected their willingness to speak out because they were a bit afraid about their safety. These are some of those people. They're living in small little houses. These are friends of mine. So yeah, 1996 they were moved. 20 years of lack of land, and then finally revived in 2012. And they're given these small little resettlement houses to live in with no farmland. And of course, when it came to resettle again, many of the villagers demanded, give us some land. We'll move to resettlement area. Just give us something to farm on. Give us a little bit, just enough that we can survive. They're not asking for a lot, and still they haven't been given it up to now. And the plan to help those people that have been impacted by the water release doesn't seem to include these people at all. Nobody's, even up to now, there's no consideration of what's happening with these people, as far as I'm aware. And, same with the dewatering of the Xe Pian River. I was part of the Fisheries Environmental Impact Assessment that occurred in 1995. We knew about this problem then. We put it in our report. We knew that people would be impacted in 1995. That's 24 years ago, where we identified this problem. And still it hasn't been dealt with. So I think, this is a very important issue. So the breaking of the dam, attracted this unprecedented kind of public criticism of Lao plans to become the so-called battery of Asia, the export of energy to Thailand. And in fact, the Lao government took this quite seriously in some ways by claiming that we no longer have the policy of battery of Asia. That was something that the Lao government stated. The Prime Minister of Laos stated. They agreed to suspend any new approvals of any new hydropower dams. But a lot of people misunderstood. They didn't ever actually said that they were going to stop any dams that had already been approved. They just were not going to approve any new projects, Cambodia, because they were impacted by this project, you think that they would have, been calling for compensation for all the impacts that occurred there. But they didn't actually call for that. All they called for was more cross-border disaster management. And that's largely, I think, because Cambodia has plans for their own dams. So, if they start complaining about Lao dams, maybe Laos will complain about Cambodian dams. And so, it becomes a kind of lowest common denominator, Nobody wants to complain for fear that they will become the subject of complaints from other people. So this has been a very serious problem. There's been no compensation at all given to the people in Cambodia that have been impacted by this. Nothing. People lost their whole rice crop. They lost their subsistence livelihood for the whole year. in many cases, because this water, the rice was underwater for over a week. That means all the rice is dead. You know, so these are very serious issues that have to be considered. The other thing that's kind of ironic is that a lot of the impacts of the catastrophic impacts of the dam that people took so seriously early on have now turning into a kind of a slow violence in and of itself. There was all this, you know, interest, there was all this aid that came in, but a few months later, once that aid was gone, the people that are living downstream and living in these resettlement villages have really been faced with a lot of poverty, lack of, you know, the payments of money and rice that has come in very slow in a lot of cases. It's, you know, people have a lot of malnutrition issues. You know, people have been living in very squalid conditions, a lot of health problems that have occurred. They're supposed to be receiving, you know, about 20 kilograms of rice per person, and then 100,000 geep per month, and then 5,000 per day to buy food. It comes out to about $30 a month plus rice is what they're supposed to be getting. But often those payments have been slow in coming, or, you know, they haven't come exactly when they expected. It's caused a lot of confusion and problems. So in a way, and people are expecting that these, and they're very slow to build their temporary houses. It's taken, now they're built, but it's taken over 6 months to build these houses. So people living in tents for many, many months before they went into those places. It also had other kinds of impacts. So a lot of times families had children who were away studying in school, and they were relying on their parents to send them money to keep them in school. And then once the parents were totally impacted by this, where they could no longer give money to their kids, some kids have had to like drop out of school, which is going to have impacts that will, you know, potentially be, you know, for their lives, you know. And so there's a lot of other issues that need to be considered in relation to this. And people are saying that those villages may never be able to move back to their old villages. So they've been clearing land for them and told them that they won't be rice farmers, they'll have to become cassava farmers in higher areas, which is a kind of a whole new occupation for these people. These are fishermen and lowland rice farmers that are very used to kind of living in the floodplain. To be, you know, cassava farmers on higher land is going to be a difficult adaptation process for them. And I think that hasn't been adequately considered. The other thing that we see happening that's also going to be in the long term is a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder is now emerging. Anxiety, depression, sleep disorders often occur when these types of catastrophic disasters occur. Although the impacts can be uneven and some can occur over very long periods, some for shorter periods of time. There's been research done in particular in relation in the United States on the Beaver Creek Dam in West Virginia, which broke in 1972, causing like 125 people to die and displaced a large number of people. So very similar to the Xe Pian Namnoy Dam, and they've done longitudinal studies looking at what was the impacts after 5 years, after 10 years, after 20 years. There are people after 20 years or more who are still faced with that PTSD as a result of that dam. So a catastrophic event is now becoming slow violence through things like PTSD, which is emotionally affecting people. And there has also been reports coming out. For example, in February, this last February, there's a Korean aid organization working down there, and they told Radio Free Asia that some of them, the survivors, are still having nightmares about the night of the disaster. They feel scared when they visit their houses. So, you know, even going back to their villages, places where their children, where their family relatives were killed, you know, where they experienced great trauma. And these are people that know very, you know, these are people that have lived in these places all their lives. These are not people that have migrated from other places. These are long-term communities that have hardly seen other places. These are indigenous peoples and ethnically Lao people that are from these areas originally. So it's very difficult to understand what they're going to do. They don't have a high level of education or skills where they can go out and find jobs elsewhere. All they can do is sort of day labor. They have a huge amount of knowledge when it comes to the river and their agricultural cycles and the forests in those areas. They know a lot. But those skills aren't transferable if they have to go live in the cities and things like that. They're not prepared for this, right? So it's a very serious situation. And, how are they going to view? I mean, a lot of people have sort of understood dam building and related infrastructure to be kind of a symbolic of modernization. People see that, they put them on the bills of the money. It's seen as a very positive thing. But when you're experiencing this kind of impact, you might imagine that people are going to view infrastructure in a very different way. And you can imagine that even if they were allowed or they could move back to their villages, are they going to really, and even if they don't have PTSD, I mean, could they really, would you sleep well at night knowing that that dam upstream could potentially break again after what happened? I mean, it's going to change the whole way that they understand the place that they come from, right? So these are, tremendous implications that we're just beginning to understand. It's not far enough along to really understand all of what's happening. But I think we can see that this is going to be slow violence in the end. Catastrophic violence is becoming slow violence. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about the responsibility for this. One of the things that a Korean politician released some information in October 2018, so a couple months after the dam had broken. And he had received information that SK Engineering Construction, the lead corporation that is part of the consortium that owns this dam, had actually decided to reduce the project saddle or auxiliary dams by an average of 6.5 meters from what the original plan was. So the plan was to have higher auxiliary dams, which would provide more flexibility for large rain events, right? And the company said, hey, they were looking for ways to cut corners, ways to save money. And they have internal documents that indicate that one person was saying to the company, well, we can save $19 million if we reduce the size of the auxiliary dams by 6.5 meters. And so this indicates that, they were really trying to cut corners. Now, the second thing, most recently, is the Deputy Prime Minister of Laos, Boonthong Jitmani, just earlier in March, not long ago, just a couple weeks ago, less than a couple weeks now, he's the head of the committee that's trying to look into the causes of the impacts of the dam. And I will give him some credit. I think that he has actually made some very honest statements about the situation. He has acknowledged they hired a bunch of experts to come in and look at what was going on. And what they found is that SK had not done proper soil studies. They drilled holes that were not international standards, and they was not done properly. They had, again, trying to cut corners, and he has clearly put the blame on the companies for doing improper studies. And he has even made the statement saying, if we knew what they were doing at that time, if we had realized the level of risk that company was taking, we would not have allowed this dam to be built. But they didn't know. But at least he's admitting. At least he's admitting. They're getting the data out now, and he's admitting that this has happened, which I think is a great first step for a level of transparency, right? To admit that what's going on, so there can be real lessons learned from this. They only drilled 3 holes, and they were not, they weren't as deep as they could have been, and the soil type around there is not appropriate for this kind of dam situation. Now, obviously, they've invested over $1 billion in this project. Now they're trying to fix the dam. I'm not sure at this moment, with this kind of statement coming out, and the final results, these are sort of preliminary findings, the final results haven't come out. Is this dam going to be subject to more danger in the future, or more risks in the future with this kind of information, right? But I think it took a lot of guts for the Deputy Prime Minister to at least acknowledge that this is the case, and so I will give him a lot of credit for that. So in conclusion, we can say that the Xe Pian River Dam is causing this catastrophic violence and also slow violence. Slow violence has been taking place for over 20 years. The impacts of this dam did not begin on July 23rd, 2018. They began in 1996. But nobody here in this room had probably ever heard about those impacts at that time. And importantly, these catastrophic, different types of impacts are, continuing, and it's going from catastrophic to slow violence, and a lot of political and ecological implications over time. And that's about it for me. Thank you. I'm happy to receive some questions about this. I couldn't get into all the details of what's going on, but I think hopefully you get the general picture of the situation.
You know, if I can kick things
Yeah.
off with a quick question. I mean, you've collected this information because you have frequent touch or constant touch with stakeholders on the ground, those that are impacted on the ground, and you speak several languages of those within this area and the Mekong Basin itself. So, you know, that's a testimony to one as an academic and as someone who's previously engaged in a lot of development work, that being informed and knowing these languages is the way to gain this information and be able to spread and disseminate the right story and the truth around this issue. But quick questions. One on hydraulic authoritarianism. You mentioned that hydraulic authoritarianism is basically defined by the control of information about hydropower in Laos. But there has been a proclamation from the Deputy Prime Minister that there is some blame here, and it's related to poorly designed hydropower projects. Is that a crack in the system?
Well, I would say that it's kind of unprecedented. And like I said, I want to give the Deputy Prime Minister a lot of credit for that, because it's not the type of pattern that we've seen in the past. Whether that is going to lead to long-term changes in the way hydropower is understood and the way that transparency is occurring, that's still to be seen. But I do think that we have to give credit where credit's due, even if it's only at a kind of preliminary level at this point. So I don't have a crystal ball to predict the future, but I would say that that's very unprecedented, and I would say that we when there's criticism due, we need to be critical, and when things are done in an appropriate way, we need to say that as well. So that I'm trying to be fair, to the Lao government in that regard.
Another quick question.
Yeah.
Slow violence. Is slow violence a Lao hydropower issue, or is it related to hydropower in the Mekong Basin? Is it also emanating
I
in
think
other
it's
parts
more
of-
broadly. I don't think it's just in Laos. I mean, you can see similar things in Thailand. You can see similar things in Cambodia. I think even in China. I think we can see that in all the countries where impacts have occurred. I think one of the things, though, that's kind of special about Laos maybe is, oddly enough, some of the companies that have invested there, in some cases, have actually wanted to provide more compensation than the government has allowed them to. So private companies from foreign countries have wanted to give more compensation. The government has said no. Why? Because they're afraid of setting precedent of giving high levels of compensation, because they're fearful that their own projects, they won't be able to afford to pay that level, and it'll make them look bad with local people, or that investors might not want to invest as much in Laos if they believe that the costs for compensation are actually what they should be. One of the attractiveness of they believe in investing in Laos is a kind of hydraulic authoritarianism. People don't dare to protest. People don't dare, you don't have to pay too much compensation. You can keep costs down. You can externalize the costs and not have to actually pay them all, and that can be something that's attractive. But the problem, of course, is that, and a lot of times the companies end up kind of monitoring themselves. In the case of the Xe Pian River Dam, the companies were essentially regulating themselves. It's very hard for the Lao government to monitor all these projects going on. There's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, they don't have the budget. So if you're a government official who's sitting up in Vientiane, and you want to go monitor different projects, you've got to have budget. You've got to have money, to go there. You've got to have per diem. You've got to have accommodation money. And they don't have that budget. So they can stay in their offices. They can't go down to check. Secondly, expertise. There is a limited number of people in Laos that have the level of expertise to really adequately monitor these projects. So even if they had budget, they don't necessarily have the technical skills to really know what's appropriate. They have a small number of people. Most of the high-level technical people have been hired by the private companies because they get much higher salaries. So high-level people aren't existing in the government. So in the United States, for example, the government is able to do a certain level of public interest monitoring of development projects because they have budget, they have qualified people that can do that. That causes the companies to be more self-attentive. In this case, cutting corners, nobody may ever catch it. If the dam hadn't broken, they could have gotten away with it. The third problem is political mandate to actually critically examine these projects. So if you're somebody working in the government and you realize that these projects are totally supported by the government may not reward you if you go down and find problems with them. They may not actually want to hear that because that may make it more difficult, or it may cause investors to not want to invest as much, or it may slow down projects, it may reduce profitability, all these things. So even if you were somebody that had the budget, that had the skills, which they don't, you would still need to have the political mandate to actually go and be critical about projects. I have met many government officials who've gone and seen problems with various projects, and they know what the problems are, but they don't want to talk about them because it's not going to help their careers. So there needs to be a cultural change in which the government starts to say, hey, we actually want to hear what's going on with these projects. And I think that the Deputy Prime Minister, in his recent statements, is a good first step, right? That's indicating to people that the government at the highest levels is acknowledging that there's a problem. That's the first step, you know, to getting that kind of support. I think I had the first question over here.
So, that was really a great description of what's the problems down there.
Can you introduce yourself quickly?
So I'm assuming that
Murray, can you introduce yourself? And everyone else, please.
I'm assuming that the Saddle Dam was sinking because of, sorry, I'm supposed to wait for the microphone. So I'm Murray Hebert, CSIS. I'm assuming that the dam was sinking because of the soil problem, right? And secondly, what's happening now on the construction? I mean, is it still basically stopped to do the research?
They're trying to, you know, fix it, and they're about 6 months behind schedule. But they're still planning to complete this, you know, maybe about 6 months later than they would have. So the dam was already sort of over 90% completed at the time that it broke. So we're looking at about a 6 month delay. So maybe by near the end of the year, it should be done, right? It should be, and there is a $50 million insurance policy that the company has. So $50 million through a whole bunch of different insurance companies that they're now using some of that money to try to do this rebuilding. Unfortunately, very little of it seems to be going to the villages that have been impacted, including in the reservoir area. They're getting almost nothing.
And then just last thing, so that you said the Thais were really freaked out at what happened. They're not saying, maybe telling the government, maybe we shouldn't be buying this electricity anymore?
I think there are people in Thailand that are concerned about that. You know, the odd thing is one of the reasons why so many dams are being built in Laos is because it's become politically very difficult to build dams in Thailand because they have more civil society there. Villagers can protest more there. It's very difficult for them to build dams in Thailand right now. And that's why Laos has become an attractive place to invest. One of the things that happened right after the dam broke was Ratchaburi Power, the Thai the partner, was releasing information to the Thai media claiming that the dam had broken and a day later they'd fixed it, that they'd resolved the problem. And the Thai media was just taking that at face value, and I saw the reports when they were making those claims. Later on, I heard from people that one of the big problems is that Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand gives advertising to almost all the television stations in Thailand. And therefore, if you were to give negative reporting about Ratchaburi Power's investments, you could jeopardize some of that lucrative advertising money. And that may cause the Thai media to be, the mainstream Thai media, to be less inclined to criticize the Thai aspect of this investment. That's what I've been told by people from PBS in Thailand, which is the public broadcasting. They said they were the only ones who were able to report freely on this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist. Laos is not a paragon of democracy, so it's certainly believable that hydrological authoritarianism could be describing what's going on there. But it seems to me that in your last answer, you might have hinted at what maybe we ought to be looking at here, which is that dams should not break. I mean, they're not built to break and flood villages. That's not their purpose. So, conceding that many people were relocated, possibly forcibly so, for the building of these dams, and many people suffered when these dams broke. At the same time, is that the problem, or is the problem that EGAT or Chinese investors or somebody else are building poor dams that are breaking and killing people, and that's what we should be concerned about?
Well, I think we should be concerned with all those things.
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
I don't think it's one or the other. I mean, I think that previously there was almost no consideration of safety. Safety was hardly ever discussed. You would hear villagers sometimes, claiming, "Oh, well, what if the dam broke?" But but people had never really experienced it, and so that those concerns weren't taken seriously, and the villagers didn't have the technical expertise to really understand that. Now, it does appear that the government is putting a lot more effort into considering safety issues, which is great. But even if you solve the safety issue, even if you do things so dams don't break anymore, which would be great, that's not going to stop the slow violence of dams. That's partially what my point is this is not simply a safety issue. Safety is the new issue that's come out as a result of the break. But these dams have been causing all kinds of problems, and villagers have been impacted by those projects, have not been adequately compensated in almost all cases. So the problem is more broader. Safety needs to be considered. Maybe some projects shouldn't be located in certain places, so some projects just shouldn't go ahead because they're being built in places with geological conditions that are not appropriate. But there also needs to be consideration of all the other kinds of impacts, like dewatering rivers, relocation, hydrological impacts downstream, blocking of fish migrations.
Does Laos have an alternative to building dams in terms of economic development, in your mind?
I think that what we can see right now is that there are lots of alternatives. Laos is a very hot country. There's actually an American company that has has a concession in Laos to make solar farms. And this is a private company that expects to make a profit. Not a subsidized aid situation. But one of the problems is that, from the Soviet era, dams have always been viewed as sort of a symbol of high modernism. Also, a lot of government officials have been kind of learned about dams over the years as kind of a positive thing. People have been sent away to study about them. Not necessarily about the safety issues or about the environmental impacts, but about the engineering aspects of it. So there's a lot of people in the government that see hydropower as the only path forward, because that's kind of what they've learned over 20, 30 years. That was before the price of solar power generation declined by such a dramatic level over the last 5 years. So the whole economic situation has changed. 5 years ago, solar power was not economically viable on a large scale. That has all changed due to technological advances. I think there are lots. I mean, there could be a lot more done with wind as well. There could be more done with geothermal. There are lots of other options. There already are a number of dams built in the country. Laos already has, more than enough energy for itself. So they could put a lot more efforts into other forms of energy generation, which would provide a more balanced, energy portfolio, more or less. Yeah.
Get over here.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Bad timing. Ian, Rich Cronin from Stimson. I don't want to take away from your really important major theme about the slow violence versus the catastrophes. But it seems to me that you started out mentioning, I don't know how many, 180 dams, how many dams are planned, et cetera. It seemed to me that there's so much squishy information about these issues, the dam issues. So you have how big are these dams, how many of them are really big, dangerous dams, how many are small affairs. Where's the Laos? You mentioned accurately that, well, they can't use all the power that's being built, but that's part because they don't need money to do grids. They don't need money to do more local power projects, and there's no money in it for an investor because the Lao people are too poor to buy the electricity anyway. It has to be kept cheap. Now, but at the same time, Thailand is really high on the scale of terms overbuilt. They have excessive demand anyway, power for demand. You got Myanmar coming up with much more big hydro potential than Laos. So after 11 years or 12 years of working on this issue, I still don't get it in terms of the economics and the finances of these projects. So obviously, the issue you're worried about would be helped greatly by many fewer dams. But I don't understand what that figure means, 180 or whatever dams that are on the books, and how many have actually been cleared, and how many are still pending review. Thank you.
Yeah, it was actually Brian who said that 180 number, not me.
Okay, sorry about that.
But I will say this, is that it's a bit uncertain. It always has been, because you have these sort of concessions given to study projects. A lot of the companies that get these concessions don't necessarily have plans to build the dams themselves. They want to study them, and then they want to try to find another investor to put the money into them. And sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. Many dams have gone through multiple iterations of investors that have come and gone, the dam is still not built. So there's not, so when we say there's 180, it's unclear how many of those will actually emerge. It depends a lot on how much power Thailand is willing to buy. Because quite honestly, if Thailand were to say no more, almost all those projects would disappear.
One quick
Yeah.
question. The channel dam that broke,
Yes.
did it have gates?
No.
No.
No. It wasn't.
It's a wall.
It was a wall. That's right.
They couldn't relieve the flow.
No, I mean, they did try to release water down the Xe Namnoy once they realized what was happening, but it was too slow. And it was also going to cause problems down there as well.
Yeah, there are ways to draw down a reservoir.
Right, but
The physics intervenes.
Yes.
And you need information to know how much.
and it takes a lot of time to do it without causing other kinds of flooding down the Xe Namnoy. And there was other dams there that could also have been damaged that were below that one. So that's another problem.
I'm just helping to moderate because the
Okay.
mic is moving around.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you, Professor Beer. My name is Bunjan Sentavong. I'm a Lao American. This issue, the dam collapse, affect us personally. So, to me, like you said, that this is death are preventable to save loss of life. Why they don't have the alarm system to warn the villagers? Because when I read news, all the company that involved in this construction, the workers, the expert, whatever, they are safe. They're gone the day that they feel that it's break. So if they have a warning system, then maybe villagers, we can save more life. And then second portion, dams, it's an issue that date back many decades around the world because the environment impact all of the cultural livelihood of villagers, all of the people are numb about this issue anymore now. Because to me, Laos is very tiny in size, tiny in expertise, tiny in good governance, everything. And then if we, in the name of the economic development, and developing country try to use the dam to help them to move up, to live up the poverty. But it's not up to them because they are so limited in knowledge, in expertise, everything. To me, I think I kind of put this on the shoulder of the financial system institution because they are the one who approve the loan, the mortgage to all of these things. And if they study enough, they see through everything enough, maybe accident wouldn't happen. Because if you're based on developing country, they are not capable to see through all of those. Thank you.
So there's actually a lot of questions there or comments. Let me start by saying that, yeah, there wasn't an alarm system in place. They didn't have any kind of system. When they the Adipur government received a phone call from the company telling them to evacuate people at about 10 in the morning on the day that, and then it got to the governor's office, but they didn't have any system in place. There weren't people on the ground. There wasn't a plan in place to evacuate at all. So it took them some time just to, contemplate about what they were going to do about this. And finally, once they got to doing about it, the dam was almost breaking. So yes, they had no plan at all. There was no plan in place. Secondly, I do think that there is some blame to be put on financial institutions. Now, most of these projects have been funded by private capital. Early on, most of the dams were funded by, Asian Development Bank, World Bank. That has become less the case. It's much more about private, except for the Chinese dams that are still getting a lot of government support. But the finance institutions have supported transmission lines, master plans, a lot of the infrastructure that is important for, hydropower development. Those have been supported by the financial institutions. And more importantly, a lot of the big financial institutions have encouraged the government to go down that path to development, saying, well, Laos will become the Switzerland of Asia. That kind of, you'll become a rich country. So there's they've received a lot of, and a lot of that has to do with Western countries that are no longer building dams, but they still have industries producing turbines. They still have expertise, consultant agencies that want to be hired to do things. And they want to help, so they provide export credits that will allow their companies to sell their turbines, that will allow the expertise from their countries to be hired to advise on these projects. So the governments and the aid agencies often don't want to directly fund dams because it's too controversial, but they're funding everything else that, except for the actual projects, all the infrastructure that makes these projects possible. And when I say infrastructure, I mean human infrastructure, political infrastructure, economic advice, all the things that are required to create an assemblage that allow these projects to emerge. I would also say that they've been told, the other thing that's important to realize is you brought up that they're being built for poverty alleviation. So it's true that the central government is getting some level of revenue from a lot of these projects, from selling the energy. Often, though, it's at the expense of the people in the local area that are being impacted. So in some ways, it's a transfer of wealth from poor people living in the vicinity of these projects to the central government. And actually, the idea is that revenue, once the government gets it, will be used to alleviate poverty. But a lot of that money hasn't been well managed. And it's, kind of disappeared it's getting, a lot of, big houses and fancy cars being purchased in the capital city. And very little of it is getting down to those people who have been impacted. Now, if you're really concerned about poverty alleviation, you've got to deal with the poorest people. And the poorest people don't seem to be benefiting from these projects. So, finally, to do with the Xe Pian Namnoy Dam itself, there was about over $80 million that came directly from the Korean government. So I think the Korean government, as part of their overseas development aid, has to take some responsibility. And this was approved under the previous government, of which the Prime Minister is now in jail for corruption. And there seemed to have been a close relationship between SK Construction and Engineering and the government. So there seems to have been, why did they decide to put $80 million into supporting a private project that was going to primarily benefit big Korean companies? That's a big question as well. So I think there's a lot of things, and I know there's been a lot of interest in Korea about this. And the civil society there is looking into a lot of these issues as well. We're going to see how it all pans out. But I think that there is a lot of problems in the way the Korean government and these Korean companies have dealt with this issue.
A quick two-finger, and then we'll get to Frank's question, which will likely be our last question. I've been talking to stakeholders in Korea that are actively working to have more advocacy and attention put on this particular disaster. And there's a sentiment that the interest is on the decline because the Korean government promotes public-private partnerships as a way to engage bilaterally with other countries and wants to continue promoting that. So it's keen to kind of sweep this one aside and keep that PPP truck rolling. A quick question, though. On your statement about an alarm system or a warning system, is it right for us to watch from the West to have an assumption of, there should have been some type of alarm system that could have told villagers what was about to happen to them? And at the same time, is it proper for us to have an assumption that then perhaps because a lesson was learned, information systems will be made better in Laos for warning about these disasters?
So, whether how much money and how much effort should be put into this warning system, I think, there's a lot of areas that are problematic. I wouldn't want to just focus only on the catastrophic disaster. I think there needs to be, more energy put into the other types of slow violence more so. I think that's the real problem. That's the real, biggest problem that dams face. So that's on the. So, but it's up to the Lao government to decide how they want to deal with that. I'm not going to, tell what they should do or not to do. But I would say that it doesn't surprise me that interest is waning in Korea. I think it's waning everywhere. The amount of aid that's getting to these people has declined dramatically, and that is also being seen as a major problem. I also think, though, that they are likely to put in some kind of safety requirements to a greater degree than what they've had before. I think that's likely to happen. I think there's a real. I think that's also about, and I think that one of the things that maybe Lao needs to think about, I think they're already thinking about it, is reducing, not so many projects at the same time, have a smaller number of projects so that they can really manage those projects properly and really choose the best projects, not just have projects all over the place where they don't really know what's going on. The other thing that does concern me, though, and one of the other deputy prime ministers made a comment that said that we should not have to compensate people for downstream impacts from dams because we get big weather events, and this is likely to increase with climate change, and that therefore we're going to have to release a lot of water from these dams when these big weather events happen. They're going to cause impacts downstream. If we have to compensate everybody for those downstream impacts, that's going to be untenable. And therefore, they're normalizing this idea that dams release water and they cause impacts downstream. Downstream impacts have been very underappreciated in terms of the amount of impacts they cause. And it seems that there's an attempt to normalize those as a regular thing that comes from dams, that we should expect, and dams shouldn't be liable for this. This is also sort of protecting the interests of the owners of these dams. Sure. You know, Frank?
No, Frank Proshan. I have dozens of questions, but I'll stick with only two. One is in terms of the post-disaster interventions. If we look to the east, to Vietnam, the Army has a great reputation and earns a lot of credit for the government by the effectiveness and the efficiency of its emergency responses and post-disaster responses. And as you talked about humanitarian assistance and so on, we didn't see any real role of the Lao government or the Lao military in mobilizing resources in that intervention. Is that a lost opportunity? The second question is related to I think the issues raised by the woman a few moments ago. Going back to the younger, more innocent Ian of 1995, the notion then was that the involvement of international financial institutions with safeguards and so on would somehow reduce this slow violence or prevent this slow violence, and that without that intervention there would be this kind of cowboy frontier capitalist approaches to dam building and development in general. Obviously, no one was listening in 1995, despite those good intentions. Is there still any reason to believe that there's any way of mitigating this, or is there a certain inevitability about what you're describing?
Okay, so first on the Lao military and providing assistance, it's true. The Lao military really didn't get involved. I think it's because they don't really have the resources. They don't have a bunch of money sitting around ready to mobilize people, and provide food or even gasoline to get vehicles, things like that down. So they weren't prepared for this either. And the Lao military hasn't played a big role in disasters more generally in Laos, as has been the case in Vietnam. So, maybe it is a lost opportunity, but it's not something that people even really talked about. Even people weren't even asking the question, well, where's the Lao military? I mean, that wasn't even something that people were waiting for. It was sort of expected that they wouldn't be there. So there was, some, teams that were sent out, to look for dead people, look for survivors. There was some mobilization of disaster relief, but it took some time to do it. It was a bit slow. And so, so I don't know. I don't think we can count on that happening too much. I would say also, though, that, a lot of people have talked like they've said, well, we need the international agencies involved to create, the proper standards for this. But if you look at the Nam Trun 2 Dam in Laos, which was financed by a financial guarantee from the World Bank, and the argument at that time was that if the World Bank gets involved in this, it's going to be so much better. If not, maybe the Chinese will invest, and it'll be a much more shot at your job. But what we've seen is that the Nam Trun 2 Dam has had tremendous negative environmental and social impacts. That this project was very poorly implemented. And there's a book that just came out, University of Wisconsin Press, called Dead in the Water, which very effectively documents all the different problems that occurred with that project, despite the involvement of the World Bank in a very serious way. Essentially, the dam wouldn't have got ahead without World Bank involvement. And the ADB as well. And the ADB. It was funny because initially the ADB, when before the World Bank got involved, the ADB was saying, "Oh, we're not going to do the Nam Trun 2 because that's too big of a project. We're not going to get involved." But once the World Bank got involved, and then it gathered a lot of attention from the Lao government, then the ADB sort of started getting jealous, and so they put money in to kind of do that as well. So I'm not convinced that the involvement of these larger financial institutions will necessarily lead to better standards. One thing that we know is that when you give out a big loan, you have a lot of leverage before the loan is approved. Once the loan is approved, very few people have been promoted in the bank for stopping a loan. or if we're slowing it down, right? And there is nobody wants to say that they have a really bad project, or they've invested very poorly, or they've made some terrible mistakes. And that seems to be what's happened in relation to Nam Trinh 2 Dam and many other projects as well, and for the ADB and for the World Bank.
And the Korean aid was a contribution or a loan?
I think it was a contribution. Maybe it was a very low interest loan.
Yeah, to clarify, it was a low-interest
Yeah.
loan that supported
Yeah.
the Lao equity
Yeah, that's
in
right.
the project.
That's right. Yeah. But
We
very low
have
interest.
to, unfortunately, wind down and conclude this excellent event. And, Ian, I think perhaps a next good step would be to invite you back to have a teach-in, an all-day teach-in about what's happening in the Mekong region, because you really not only unveiled and made clear many of the facts and the stories that are coming out of this particular disaster site, but you've opened up a wide door to allow us to better understand the political economy around hydropower in Laos and Cambodia and the rest of the Mekong Basin. I want to thank you for coming to Washington, and we look forward to having you back again sometime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Ian's going to stick around for some media interviews, but if you're, please feel free to continue eating some of this great Thai food. There's more out there, and we're not going anywhere. So.
Oh, from Cambodia. Oh, right. But I'm glad that you were here because the impacts of that dam on Cambodia are very heavy. Yes, sure. Okay, yeah, good, because I have to talk about. Yeah. I'll give you that.
Yeah, excellent. This one I report the new 15 years. I learned from you 1 hour. It's very clear. Everything. Thanks a lot. Really. I like the word slow.
Well, I do think that this was something that was caused by a private company in Laos, that this had direct impacts on Cambodian people in a very serious way, and that company in Laos should have to be paying compensation to those people in Cambodia because they were the direct cause of those impacts, and the government should be representing their people by asking that company to pay for those impacts, and there should be compensation given to those people who have been impacted. I think that's what should happen. That's the right thing to do, but it hasn't happened so far.
It's because you said they want to build their own dam. So what are the impacts that's going to happen to Cambodia? They should prevent this from happening.
Well, it's true. There could be similar types of problems, safety issues that could occur with dams being built in Cambodia right now, because Cambodia has the same kind of problems as the Lao government: lack of expertise, lack of political commitment to monitoring these projects, a lack of funding to support people to do that. So many of the types of problems that I've talked about for Laos are very similar for Cambodia. I think Cambodia needs to be very careful in how they approach hydropower development.
And what about the water management for using for other purposes? Is this sound opportunity about what about other purpose of using the water in the Mekong River?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of downstream impacts from dams upstream in